All right. Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about hamstring injury prevention in the AFL. And I guess I'm going to sort of give out my proposed strategy and how we can best learn to combat this. So I've sort of put my physio brain on, I've scoured the internet, I've scoured all the research out there, and I'm going to put together what I think is the most suitable plan to stop hamstring injuries occurring, or at least as best as possible, prevent them. So, in terms of a bit of background on this, unfortunately, hamstring strains continue to be the number one injury in football, whether it's soccer or AFL. They continue to be number one by a country mile. And it's interesting to see that, despite, a wealth of knowledge and continuing education and studies on it, we're sort of not seeing a decrease at all within their incidents occurring. In the AFL, numbers have been fairly stable across the last decade or so, suggesting that there's still a lot of work to be done here. And we think this might be explained by, players are playing quicker and faster, but we're still not overly sure. So it was interesting to read that, despite all this evidence around hamstring injuries and what we can do to stop them, there's a very large disconnect between that available evidence and what players and clubs are actually doing. And we see this through, this was a really famous Nordic study. So it showed like a really significant reduction in hamstring injuries, but we're not sort of doing that. That's a little bit complicated because they weren't going to the gym and doing other things that most club football teams are doing now. And this is a really famous sort of footy first injury prevention program that was put together. So there is stuff out there, but it seems like, we're not using them. And I think it's a complicated issue because a lot of teams, they're not just sort of local community teams. They're almost semi-professional in the sense where they're training a lot, they're going to the gym. So it sort of adds in all these factors that sort of throw off these protocols. So, in a major study of trying to figure out, right, what are the actual risks of having a hamstring injuries, and I think this is one of the best ones, we sort of found that there is some really good evidence that the following are like the major contributing factors to hamstring injuries. So the big one was age, the older you get, the more likely you are to have a hamstring injury. Previous injury, whether it's of course to the actual hamstring, an ACL reconstruction, or even tear, which likely relates to graft types. Hamstring is the most common graft type for an ACL at an AFL level. But it also can be, the way that your kinematics might change after an ACL injury. Calf strain was a really big one. Strength was a major focus and something that was shown to increase the likelihood of hamstring injuries if there's a lack of strength, and we'll talk about that later. Fascicle length, which sort of relates to strengthening and isn't maybe that's something that's going to be a major focus of today, but basically you want your fascicles to be long and strong, but they do lengthen with a lot of eccentric training, which we'll talk about. High-speed running and consistent exposure to high-speed running is certainly a major contributing factor to hamstring injury and certainly should be a target. In terms of what was limited, well, there wasn't a lot of evidence that the playing position matters. So you would think, right, if playing position matters, your midfielder who runs the most probably has the greatest amount of hamstring strain. But unfortunately, that isn't the case. It doesn't matter whether you're forward, whether you're back, or what. They all can have it. Flexibility was very, very low in terms of whether they cause hamstring injuries. And we see now a lot of clubs, which they probably should, are sort of going away from that static stretching and really trying to improve length in their tissue, because we know that maybe actually strength is what's going to help get you that length and prevent that injury from occurring. So that was interesting. And fatigue sort of what didn't play as big of a role as we thought, but I'll sort of touch back to that in a bit later. So in terms of, right, how do we target and actually minimize hamstring injuries? Well, we really got to look at the modifiables. And for me, the modifiables are definitely high-speed running / you're sort of sprinting, and then we're thinking strength. And there's evidence for, yes, we want nice, strong hamstrings, but we also need nice strong glutes. We also need a really good lumbopelvic control and strength through that region. And we want nice strong calves because sort of in terms of the anatomy of the calves, they still cross over the knee joint, so they still contribute to the function that a hamstring does as well, which is a little bit complicated, but the point is we want strong calves. So let's start with high speed exposure. So in terms of sprinting, sprinting by far and away is the greatest hamstring demand, even over, what we would consider to be the highest hamstring load exercise we could think of, which is probably like a Nordic. So even over that, sprinting still exceeds how much demand is placed on the hamstrings. And we know, and this is a really important detail for people playing football at community levels, as the running / speed intensity increases, so does the demands of the hamstring. And this is super important. So as we sort of can see here, slightly complicated diagram, but not really. All we're looking at is medial hamstrings, which are important, but probably lateral hamstrings are more important, as these are the ones that normally tend to go more than the medial, but that's okay. What we can see here is if our run intensity is around this sort of 70 to 80% or so, we're looking at around about a 33% medial hamstring activation, but we're looking at around that sort of 40 to 80%, depending on what study you look at, activation in terms of our lateral hamstring. So still high, but we can see here that if you climb to 80 to sort of 90%, you're still only getting to around 80 to 90% activation of your hamstrings, which is still high, but really, this is the most important factor. When our run intensity is really that sort of 90 to 100%, so let's sort of average it out to say 95% plus, then we're finally looking at that 100% activation of our medial and our lateral hamstrings. Suggesting that, when we do our running speed exposure, and we all know it, we see at the footy club, we have the players that are sort of holding themselves back. Well, you're almost doing yourself a disservice. We really need to be hitting that 95% plus range in order to get the activation we need to get that protectiveness. Then comes the question of, right, well, how much sprinting should we be doing? And this was a really cool study. We see this like U curve, and what we find is it's kind of like you don't want too little. So if we see here, we've got the likelihood of subsequent injury. If we're doing too little, then our incidence of injury increases. But if we're also doing too much, then our incidence of increases as well. So what's that sort of perfect number? Well, it seems like this sort of middle range, that sort of 6 to 10 weekly exposures to maximal velocity, not submaximal, that maximal velocity, meaning that 95% plus, is where we sort of need to be sitting in order to get that protectiveness. So what does that mean for you guys who are playing your club level footy? Well, we want to be 95% plus high speed running efforts, and we want to be doing that for around sort of 6 to 10 exposures across the week. And I think the best time to do this, and what a lot of AFL clubs will do as well, is they just do this during their warm-up at training. So if you train twice a week, which most clubs do, then we want to be hitting around that 3 to 5 maximal exposures within each of the sessions. Then leads us to strength. So we can see here, what he's got? He's got 100, 130, 140. That's pretty strong box squat. So strengthening is a big factor in protecting hamstrings as well. And all your AFL clubs put a big focus on the strengthening. It was interesting to read about that. So what we know about the hamstrings is, in terms of how they tear, it's normally a very high eccentric loading, meaning like a lengthening loading. So the hamstring is lengthy under a lot of force, and that's what sort of pops it over the edge, and then it'll tear. So then in the gym, we could argue, right, eccentric loading therefore must become the main focus, as we want to sort of strengthen this up as much as we can. And going back to what I mentioned earlier, we know that the history of calf, knee, pelvis injuries are all risk factors in themselves. So it's one thing, yes, we want to target the hamstrings, and that's the big that target, but we also need to do everything around it. So when we think about strengthening our hamstrings, I think you've got to subclassify it into hip dominant exercises, and we'll talk about each of those in a second, knee dominant exercises, and this idea of the super maximal eccentric loading exercises, which are basically your Nordics, and we got to treat them all a little bit differently, but make sure we target those per week. So if we think about what's the difference between hip dominant and knee dominant, well, this is your diagram of your hammies here. As we can see here, these are your lateral hamstrings or your bicep hammies. These are the ones that more commonly tear in AFL players. I say more commonly because it's generic, but this is the ones that you most commonly tear. There are also, a lot of tendon issues and mid-tendon issues, but this is most common. And then you got your medial hamstrings here. And what we know is the hip dominant exercises, which I'll talk about now, they're going to activate more your lateral hammies or your bicep hammies. They're all still going to work, but that's going to target them more. And your knee dominant is more going to target your medial hamstrings. Okay, again, they all still work, but it's something to consider if you're a recurrent hammy tearer, right? Are you doing your biceps more or your medial side? Okay, you're doing your biceps a lot. Okay, how much hip dominant strengthening are you doing? That's immediately the question we've got to ask. So in terms of hip dominant exercises, there are a range of different things we can talk about. I've just picked the ones that are in the literature the most and have the most evidence around them that most people can do. So I really like this. This is a 45-degree hyperextension, and we're thinking about doing it single leg if we can. And we can see in this diagram, right, he's got a 10-kilo plate as well, so you can really load it up. But as you sort of lower yourself down and lift yourself back up, yeah, it's going to work your lower back and your glutes, but you're getting a lot of activity through your hammy here. And you can increase this by sort of almost like digging your heel into the pad behind you. And that's going to activate your hammies even more, rather than as sort of you come down, your leg might straighten and hyperextend a bit more. So don't let that happen. You want to be digging that heel into the pad and trying to strengthen it up. So I've got an example here of someone who comes on one leg, right? They're going to lower themselves down, so they're getting a bit of a stretch, and then they're going to come back up, boom. And you can see a lot of glute activation there as well, which is good. And then another rep as well. And again, this is unloaded, but you can certainly add some weight to this to make it, to progress it along. So that's a good one. Next, we have RDLs or remaining deadlifts, or actually reverse deadlifts. Really good. I think there are a million ways you can do it. The most common is obviously double leg variations. We can see here that this gentleman's doing a B stance or a staggered grip or staggered stance, where the front leg, so his right leg, is what's going to be basically taking most of the load there. But there are also really good single leg options where, again, this person's using a landmine. And this is a great way to do it because you're a bit more stable as opposed to just holding a dumbbell or a kettlebell where it's not connected to anything. So you got a little bit of a stability requirement. But I think the good thing I like about this is you got to watch the front leg, right? If you're bending your knee too much, then you might be getting a lot more quad and glute activation. You're almost turning it into a bit of a lunge. So you want to keep this front leg relatively stiff so you can get that sort of lengthening through the hammies that you want, and you can sort of strengthen them up through there. Another hip dominant exercise is a hamstring bridge. Is it an okay exercise? You can do a double leg, you can do it single leg like this gentleman's doing here, and you can also look to add weight on the hips. Good exercise. Your potential to load it is less than your RDLs, and you're also not getting that stretching effect. So you could argue, okay, maybe it's low on the priority list, but it's still a really good way to build some strength to that hammy and glute region. So then we move on to our more knee dominant exercises, which you should always do as well. Here we've got a Swiss ball rollout, which you put your leg on a Bosu ball there or a Pilates ball, and you're gonna control it as you straighten your leg and then curl your heel to your bum. And you can see this guy's doing a really good job of keeping his hips super high as he does it. You know, the temptation when you do this is to allow your hips to drop. You don't want to do that. You want to keep your hips as high as possible. This guy's doing a perfect job, and you're almost keeping a straight line between your knee, your hip, and your shoulder. These are super duper tough exercise, one that I really, really like. Slider wise, it's the same idea. We can see this guy's got some sliding pads under his foot. Again, he's keeping a nice straight line between his hip, knee, and shoulder, which is what you want. And he's doing a double leg version where he's lengthening out and having to curl back in. But of course, we want to, as soon as we can, progress to a single leg version. Now, this person's only doing the eccentric portion or that sort of lengthening portion. It'd be pretty bloody tough to curl your heel back in as well. But again, this is such a good exercise to strengthen up your hammies as you sort of lengthen them out. It's actually really hard to control. So he's doing a good job there. Next, we have the hamstring curl machine. So the hamstring curl machine is still a really good piece of equipment to strengthen your hamstrings. Now, the argument is, you don't want to do normal hamstring curls because your concentric, meaning like as you basically get your leg from straighten to leg bend, is going to limit how much eccentric you can do. So I sort of agree with that. And I think, I still think they're a good exercise to do, but maybe what we should be doing is this version here. So as you can see here, he's going to go up with two legs and then he's going to come down with one leg, right? So again, he's getting that eccentric loading. Now, if he was just using one leg, potentially he can't even get the weight up. So the point is, if you do this version, your loading must be more than what you do in just a single leg. So I think in terms of the progression, it'd almost be right. If you had a hamstring injury and you're rehabbing, maybe this is not the place to start, right? But if you've got really healthy hammies and we're looking for, we want this protective factor, we need eccentric strength, this is the version to do, where you really load it up nice and heavy and you smash yourself eccentrically and build up some really good resilience in that fashion. In terms of other knee dominant exercises, razor curls, and you can see here, because of how hard these are, we're only looking at sort of 5 to 8 rep range. I don't think you need to do more than that. But this is a super famous video of Jill Shield from GWS doing a full razor curl. Have a look at this. Now that's super impressive. Look at the control. He almost gets fully locked out, but you just call it a lockout. Why not? Because that's bloody impressive. But this is a really good exercise again, where you're going to get some really good resilience through those hammies. And then again, we're thinking about this idea of the super maximal eccentric, and basically this is the Nordic. And in terms of dosage, we want to be keeping it relatively low because these are going to make you be the most sore and they're sort of the most fatiguing, but we want them high intensity. So we can see that this gentleman here he's strapped a 10-kilo plate to his chest and he's doing his Nordics, which is full on. I'll talk about how many to do a bit later, but really I've taken this straight from the Hawthorn Football Club, and what their physios do there is they're just doing two sets by 3 reps early in the week, and they do the first rep at around 80% intensity, second rep at 90% intensity, and the last rep they're doing at 100% intensity. So I think that's a really good way to do it. There's a lot of talk out there of, how necessary are Nordics, how necessary or not are they. Look, there's so much evidence for the effectiveness of a Nordic, so it's almost like you don't want to maybe miss out on them. But again, when you listen to what the AFL clubs are doing, there are periods in time over the last decade where Nordics aren't part of their hamstring prevention program. So it's not like, oh, you must do your Nordic, but I really think that it probably does play a picture in a well-rounded hamstring prevention program. But maybe during the season, this is more what it looks like. Now, off season might be different, but this is more what I'm thinking. But then again, we've got to think about, okay, that's the hammies. You've got to think about everything else. So again, we know that weakness in the hip extensors or the glutes is a factor for hamstring injury. So it's super important that we strengthen this. Now, again, when we're thinking community level football, there's a lot of corporate workers. There's a lot of people who are sitting at a desk a lot. And that sort of means that, their big, strong hip extensors probably aren't doing a lot of work throughout the day, probably get a bit of weakness, then feeds into this sort of network of creating a hamstring injury potentially. So I think the point is we've got to strengthen them. And I think there's a million different ways to do it. I've listed some here, deadlifts, squats. I really like this loaded box squat. I think this is awesome. Notice how this box roughly, he's at a 90-degree angle at his hip and roughly a very vertical shin. If his knee was super coming forward and he was getting a more angled shin, he's getting more activity of his quad and producing more force at his knee, which might be what you want, but I think for a glute-focused step-up, you want more of that vertical shin. So get the box nice and high and get after it. So I think this is really good. I reckon in terms of your footy play, you probably want to attack it with a bit more intensity in terms of really driving up strong and then controlling down. So this guy's probably not hitting it high enough, but a great video nonetheless. And then something like a Bulgarian split squat is a really good way to target your glute. But again, thinking about a relatively more vertical shin as opposed to just your knee coming over your toe. Lumbar pelvic, yes. So again, super important that we strengthen our pelvis region, our spine, and we can think about it really easily if you want. Maybe got like your lateral hip, so things like side plank are really, really good. Don't neglect them. I really like the hip abduction version, so you're really making that bottom hip work super hard. We also can think about things like offset farmer's walks, where this guy's just got a dumbbell in one hand and he's pretending that's like a maximally filled bucket of water and he can't spill a single drop and he's having to walk with it. I think 45 seconds, a minute, something like that is a good dosage in terms of that. Pick something that's pretty heavy. So these are both good options. We also have one of my favorites, which is a kettlebell drag through, super tough exercise, having to really engage. You could also do things like a renegade row where you're in this position but you're doing rows instead, or a pelvic press, and these are all great ways to get that rotational, anti-rotational component of your hip and spine. And then lastly, we've got to think about, yes, we need strong calves as well. And there's a lot of evidence, or some evidence I should say, that calf injury weakness increases the risk of hammy injury. So I like them nice and heavy and strong. A lot of your tendinopathy research, which I know is a separate issue, but they're doing 4 sets, 6 to 8 reps, heavy as bent knee calf raises, standing calf raises. I think I really like this 4 set, 6 to 8 reps, standing calf raise machine, and just get after it. I think, which I think I've got in the next one, you can do it on the single leg calf raises in the Smith machine, probably a little bit too quick in this video, but that's fine. Or you can do as I had before, like that double leg on the other machine. There's a lot of debate, we better do our bent knee version because we need to target our soleus more as opposed to our gastroc and blah, blah. But the point is, get them done however you can. I prefer the straight leg version currently. If you ask me, maybe in a few years or a few months, I might change. But because you're still going to get soleus, you're still going to get gastroc. So that's tick. Most gyms have it. It's easy. Do it. So I think that's my mentality at the moment. But again, at 4 sets, 6 to 8 reps, heavy, tracking yourself, and you want to be progressing. So then, right, how do we put it all together? Everything I've spoken about to get the best out of your week. So I think if I was to summarize it, this would be the slide. Every week, you're basically looking to do 95% plus sprint or high speed running where you want to be doing it, roughly 1 to 2 times per week, but you're aiming for within the week 6 to 10 exposures to that super high speed. And I think the most logical way to do this would be during your warm-ups at training. If we then think about your strength, we want to be doing 1 to 2 times per week. And I think if you have a history of recurrent hammy tears, then you're sort of looking more towards that twice per week. And you want to be doing a combination of hip, knee, dominant hammy exercises. But you also want to make sure you're incorporating some glutes, some lumbar-pelvic stuff, and some calf. Now, I put in the sets and reps that I recommend. Maybe if you're doing it twice a week and you're getting a bit sore, maybe you literally start with 2 working sets, slowly progress to 3 working sets, slowly progress to 4 working sets, like something like that. So you don't have to go, all out straight away where you're smashing yourself and getting super sore, but progress yourself up. But you want to be hitting it probably, as I said, if you've got a history of hammy tears, more that twice a week is what you want. And then a low hanging fruit is you want to be doing around 1 time a week, at least for when you're in season, of this super maximal eccentric loading. So again, if we think about, I just stole this straight from the Hawthorn Footy Club. They're doing 2 sets of 3. They actually do their first set banded, where they're getting a bit more range. But, if we're just out in the footy field, right, just do your 2 sets of 3 really easy. 80% for your first, 90% for your second, 100% for your third rep. Done. I think that's a really good week. So, for example, you played on the Saturday, your Sunday's rest, right, Monday, we're up and we need to get straight to the gym, okay? So we're thinking about, right, do your warm-up, do your bike treadmill, whatever it is, get your hips moving, so crab walks, hip abduction is really good, and then we're thinking about, right, our hip dominant exercise could be an RDL, then we're into our more knee dominant exercise, our Swiss ball rollout or our sliders. Now notice I put this on early in the week because there's a bit more eccentric work, which means it could be a bit, you can get a bit sore afterwards. So you want to probably do that a bit earlier in the week. But then you want to think about, right, glutes, we've got step ups, lumbar pelvic, we've got our kettlebell pull throughs, calf, right, double leg machine calf raises, right, that's it, done. We're moving on. And I think, always good to round out your gym program if you've got time. But just think about picking one pull. So it could be a pull up, row, lat pull down, whatever it is. One push, one sort of shoulder raise, and then I always like to add in this single leg extension only because, ACL injuries are one of the biggest problems in club footy or AFL footy in general or all forms of football. And we know that quad strength is such a big factor in preventing that. So I always like just isolating one quad versus the other quad. So, I think this is always a good thing, but that's sort of like a separate talk. So that's Monday, done. Then you move on. You got Tuesday, you should be training normally. So you want to think about, okay, warm up. And remember, our goal in the week is 6 to 10 exposures. So let's get sort of 3 to 5 max effort sprint exposures. And if your club is not providing it, then, do it yourself. You got to sort of take a bit of control of your own body as well. But then you want to think about later that day or at the end of the training, okay, let's tick off our super maximal eccentric. So again, we're thinking early in the week because we might be a bit sore. So again, 2 sets of 3 is probably all you need. Done. Okay. Then there's Wednesday. Boom. Wednesday, get in. Okay. It can be a bit of a bigger gym session, but again, we probably don't want to be too sore. So we want to do our big compound movements. So I've got, right, start again, you can warm up, bike, treadmill, get your hips going, whatever it works for you. But right, trap bar deadlift straight away, glute dominant, or it could be box squat, probably trap bar deadlift. You're still going to get a bit of hammy as well, but I really like that. 4 to 5 sets, 3 to 5 reps, heavy, strong, get after it. Then maybe we whack in this 45-degree single leg hyperextension or a single leg RDL. So the low is going to be a bit less. You're not going to be as sore, but you're still stimulating the fibers. And same idea with your 2 up, 1 down, hammy curls. Again, look, you're only doing 3 sets 6 days. Don't think you need to smash yourself and do this. You just got to tick it off. So that's a really good one there. But again, we've got to tick off your lumbar pelvic stuff. So put in a pelvic press, add in your calf work. Today we're doing single leg Smith machine. Done. And then in terms of rounding out your gym work, we've got to think, do your opposites of what you did on Monday. So if you did a pull-up, so like a vertical pull, then do a horizontal row, So you're still doing a row, but instead of doing vertical, you're doing now horizontal. Same thing for your push. I mentioned the single leg extensions before. I really like them, so tick them off. your raises. You can do Copenhagen's, like for a groin exercise. There's so much you can do, but I think this would probably be as streamlined as I can think of at least. Thursday again, you got footy training. Again, you just want to get your 3 to 5 max effort sprint exposures done, and that's that done. So and then that leads us to Friday. Friday is your day off. Some people want to do a priming workout. That's up to you, but Friday's probably a day off. Let your body recover because you've sort of gone 4 days in a row on the legs basically. Even though I guess that's footy, you've got to be strong, you've got to be fit, right? So you sort of got to get after it, and that's why, again, there's a separate discussion for today. This is why pre-season is so important, because you're trying to build up your body to tolerate this, right? So if it's not tolerating it this season, that's okay. Get through it. Everyone gets through it. So get through the season really well, but then think, okay, next year, I'm going to make a change. I need to get my body fitter and stronger so I can tolerate all this. Okay, that's super important. So then, how can you help yourself? Well, again, we want to try to maximize your recovery and minimize your fatigue. So, just you can go so fancy and so crazy with your recovery. But I think if you just pick your lowest hanging fruits, you're pretty much like 95% there. And I think the best ones that I can think of at least is, get your sleep in, get your 7, 8, 9 hours, whatever you can. But, that's so important. Get your sleep going, get your nutrition right. High protein diets are really good. There's talk at the moment in the sports medicine world about low carb, high carb, blah, blah, blah. Just do what works for you. Everyone's body's a bit different. But, I think probably consistently protein intakes is relatively the most important, arguably. But get that right. Talk to a dietitian if you're not sure, or a nutritionist, or whoever it might be. Load. So again, thinking about being consistent with our load and slowly progressing rather than having big spikes in what we're doing, and minimizing. GPS data can help. A little bit more complicated at a club level. But just being consistent as you can with your training is very important. Minimizing stress. Most people have jobs, kids, whatever it might be as well outside of their footy, and people don't realize that any stress is still stress for your body. So exercise is a physical stress, so that's going to stress out your body. But again, mental stress or stuff that comes from work, blah, 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 is still stress that your body has to deal with, which influences your recovery and fatigue. So sometimes it might be a case of just acknowledging that and making a few changes. Maybe you have to peg back your strength work, for example, a little bit, not remove it, but not go as crazy to help adjust for higher stresses outside of your life. So think about that. And then in terms of post-game, I always say post-game, as soon as you come off the ground or as soon as that final siren sounds, it's all about recovery. So, gentle movement after games can really help. Next day going for a walk, going back to this idea of sleep. Try to minimize your alcohol consumption as best as you can, because it really influences this, which really influences everything else. Understand the social aspect of club footy. So it's sort of like but it plays a big factor. So maybe pick and choose when you do it and when you don't do it. Maybe the best way to go about that. But I think just to finish with, in terms of recovery and fatigue, super simple formula. Your better recovery is the harder you're going to be able to train and the more consistently you're going to be able to train. And if you're doing that, your performance is going to be better, which means, your outcomes are better as well. So something super easy to think about and visualize. But this is what we're trying to strive for in terms of our recovery. This is the argument for why performance-enhancing drugs works, etc. People are bouncing back a lot quicker, means they're training more and they're training harder, and that's why their performance is better. So if we can just do that as best as we can naturally, that's the goal. All right, that's it, guys. So feel free to send through any questions you might have, or speak to me in person, or whatever it might be, and we can talk about how to best overcome this issue. But there are lots that we can do to try to prevent hamstring injuries from occurring in the future. Thank you.